Sonic Prime is the most recent animated series based on the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. Distributed by Netflix and developed by Man of Action, best known for their work on Ben 10, Sonic Prime sees the titular Hedgehog accidentally destroy an artifact known as the Paradox Prism while fighting Dr. Eggman, resulting in his world getting split into 5 alternate universes known as Shadow Spaces, where Sonic never existed. Ending up in New York City, a dystopian world ruled by Eggman, our blue hero must travel the multiverse and gather the 5 fragments of the Paradox Prism in hopes of fixing his mistake and restoring his world. Sonic Prime is a really interesting piece of Sonic media to me for a lot of reasons, chief among them being the fan reaction. When the show premiered, the reception was largely positive, with some even going as far as to call it the best Sonic cartoon. Over time though, reception towards Sonic Prime would become more lukewarm, with the 3rd and final season having a mostly negative reception, with some now deeming it to be the worst Sonic cartoon. Granted, the fanbase revising its views on a piece of Sonic media isn't anything remotely new, but it usually takes longer than a year to happen, and I'd argue that the change in reception is extreme even for Sonic fans. Now, I did briefly talk positively about this show last year in my top 10 cartoons of 2022 video, but that was back when we only had season 1. Since then, my opinions on Sonic Prime have changed a bit. How exactly? Well, you'll see soon enough, as I share my thoughts on each season, examine the show's criticisms, and determine whether or not this series truly deserves the heat it gets. I honestly think the first season of Sonic Prime is pretty good. While it does have its fair share of issues, I still got quite a bit of enjoyment out of this first batch of episodes. Let's just get all the best stuff out of the way first. Regardless of how you feel about Sonic Prime, I don't think anyone can deny that this show's animation is just amazing. This is probably the most animated and expressive that Sonic has ever been. All of the characters are super lively, with the show making great use of squash and stretch in their movements. The area where the animation truly shines is in the show's high energy, well-choreographed fight scenes. This is the first Sonic cartoon that's really able to capture the sense of speed and excitement you feel when playing the games. While the animation is great, there are areas in the production where you can really see the show's budget constraints, namely in how New York City is the only location with incidentals populating it. All of the other locations are completely barren, with Sonic and that universe's version of his friends pretty much being the sole inhabitants. Another high point of Sonic Prime is the voice acting, with all of the actors giving great vocal performances that perfectly capture the characters that they're playing. I'd even go as far as to say that this is the best voice cast that we've ever gotten in any piece of Sonic media.
You bring it, I break it, Eggman. That's the game, and I'm still the undefeated numero uno.
The only performance that I wasn't super into was Knuckles', or more specifically, that of his multiverse variants, as portrayed by Vincent Tong. While Adam Narada's voice for the main Knuckles is perfectly okay, sounding similar to his more recent portrayals in the games and movies, the Knuckles variants are given this New Yorker accent that I don't think fits the character at all.
It's Nux. And will someone please stop this laser?
This isn't really a critique on Vincent Tong's talents as a voice actor, but more so an issue I take with the vocal direction he was given. Knuckles is also the only character whose variants are voiced by a different actor from their main counterpart. I have no idea why he's the only character they do this with, but it's kind of distracting. Then we have the characters, which are among the more contentious elements of Sonic Prime. Personally though, I think the show does a perfectly fine job of portraying the cast of Sonic the Hedgehog. Now I wouldn't call them my favorite takes on these characters, but I think Sonic Prime mostly gets the job done here. I know that Sonic's portrayal got a lot of criticism for being this cocky, impulsive idiot, but honestly I found him to be pretty likable. While he's more impulsive and less mature than a lot of his more recent portrayals, movie Sonic notwithstanding, I still think the show captures the spirit of his character well, with his empathy and sense of justice always being apparent. Now the problem that I do have with this take on Sonic is that he's kind of too likable for the story the show's trying to tell here. You see, Sonic's character arc in this show is supposed to be him realizing that he took his friends for granted and didn't value teamwork, but he's honestly not enough of a jerk for this story to really land. Yeah, he's impulsive, but from the very start, Sonic makes it abundantly clear to his friends that he truly does care about them. Like during a flashback in episode 2, Sonic disregards Tails' warnings about Eggman leading him into a trap, and literally the moment he realizes that Tails is upset over this, Sonic apologizes and reassures Tails that he truly does value him.
Sorry, Tails. I didn't mean to upset you. In fact, I've never seen you so upset.
Does that really sound like someone who needs to learn the value of friendship? Sonic even realizes that he messed up by not listening to his friends and recklessly destroying the Paradox Prism by the end of episode 3, and it wasn't really the result of any sort of character development, because he literally couldn't remember how exactly the world ended up like this until that very moment. Again, this show wants me to believe that Sonic needs to learn a lesson about friendship, while also portraying him as kind and capable of introspection early on into the show. Admittedly, I think this idea of Sonic having to learn to value his friends is done better in episodes 4 and 5. Here, we actually do get a flashback of him being a bit of a jerk and gawking at how Amy and the others are too sentimental, as well as realizing how Amy's compassion and understanding is the glue that keeps Team Sonic together after seeing how the friendship between the Boss Cage Mage variants has been strained. Granted, Sonic once again learns this lesson way too soon, and we don't actually see a ton of Prime Amy's role as the heart of the team, but an attempt was made here. More stuff like this could have gone a long way in making Sonic's arc more believable, but unfortunately, this is the only time where him having to learn to value his friends didn't feel like a complete afterthought. The only other flaw Sonic needs to overcome here is that he needs to learn to listen more and be less impulsive, which doesn't come up that much beyond the first 2 episodes, and it's not executed in a very engaging way, with it mostly amounting to the characters chastising Sonic for not listening to others. Overall, I'm in this weird place with Prime Sonic, where I like his characterization, but I don't think it meshes well with the story they want to tell with him. Sonic just needed to start out more stubborn and like 40% douchier for his arc to really land. My feelings on the rest of the cast are far less complicated. While we don't see a ton of the original versions of the main cast, from what we do see, they're pretty in line with their mainstream counterparts. The only other non-multiversal variant who gets focus here is Shadow, and the writing for him is really spot on. He's ruthless and no nonsense, but he's also level-headed and is more than capable of working alongside others. Shadow is easily one of the show's highlights, and between this, the murder of Sonic the Hedgehog, and his most recent appearance in the IDW comics, it really does seem like Sega's finally letting people write Shadow as an actual character again, and not just a slightly less insufferable version of Sasuke Uchiha, who is the worst character in all of fiction, and there's nothing anyone can say to convince me otherwise. My god, Sakura, you deserve so much better. Back on topic, the multiversal counterparts of Team Sonic like Thorn and Dread are fairly fun alternate takes on these characters, but they aren't exactly interesting, with the only exceptions being Nine and Rusty Rose. Nine is a version of Tails who, as a result of Sonic never being in his life, became a cold, cynical loner. This is just a cool, interesting idea for an alternate universe Tails that really showcases the impact Sonic had on his life. He's a fan favorite for a reason, and I really wish the other variants examined who these characters would be without Sonic like they did with Nine. Then there's Rusty Rose, a roboticized Amy who was turned into an emotionless, ruthless killing machine by the main villains. Again, another really cool concept. While we don't get much of her backstory here, I'm sure that later seasons will give us more insight into Rusty Rose's character that'll lead to a satisfying arc with her. On an unrelated note, have I ever told you guys how much I love Tempting Fate? Finally, we have the Chaos Council, an alliance of 5 alternate Eggmans who rule over New York City and are out to conquer the multiverse. My god, these guys suck. The Chaos Council have to be the absolute lamest villains in the entire franchise, and this is the series that gave us Eggman Nega. These are supposed to be an alliance of Eggman variants who turn the world into a hellish dystopia, yet they're just these jokey, generic kids cartoon villains. The Chaos Council consists of the following: Eggman as a baby, Eggman as an old man, Eggman as a teenager, Eggman as a hipster, and Eggman but with a toupee. They each have a single joke, and it's never funny. I genuinely don't understand how Sonic Prime expects me to believe that these absolute clowns, who are unironically less intimidating than Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog Robotnik, were able to take over the— Wait a second! Why are there 5 Eggman variants living in a single universe? Why aren't Eggman's alternate selves spread around the shadow spaces like the rest of the characters? The closest thing we get to an explanation as to what the Chaos Council is supposed to be is this vague vague, cryptic crap about how they've always existed. I have no idea what that's supposed to mean, but I'm guessing we'll get a more proper answer in the later seasons. I'm also a really big fan of obvious foreshadowing. Finally, there's the whole multiverse angle, which at this point in the show is pretty weak. While the alternate versions of these characters are fun, the worlds they inhabit are pretty uninspired. The shadow spaces we're introduced to so far consist of a generic dystopian city, a giant forest, and a world covered in water where everyone's a pirate. Not exactly the most captivating of alternate universes. Again, the AU characters are fun, but not enough to make these worlds feel engaging. Honestly, outside of Nine and Rusty Rose, none of the multiverse stuff is really all that interesting. I know that a lot of fans will have much rather the show use the multiverse to play with the events of the games, but as interesting as that would be, I think that might be a tall ask, considering that this is an alternate continuity, so I don't really... What's that? According to Sega, Sonic Prime shares the same continuity as the games? I'm sorry, what? I have no idea why Sega would claim that Sonic Prime shares the same canon as the games, when it's very apparent the show wasn't written with the intent of tying it into the main continuity. Sega clearly wants the series to go back to the more serious, sincere tone of 2000s era Sonic, while putting in a greater effort to make the setting more coherent, but trying to pass Sonic Prime as canon just spits in the face of those efforts. While I wouldn't call the show straight up juvenile like some critics have, there is at least some darkness in characters like Nine and Rusty. Sonic Prime's tone is that of your typical Saturday morning cartoon, and is much less mature than the likes of Sonic Frontiers and Sonic IDW. Plus, unlike the comics, there are a lot of little continuity errors in Prime that makes it hard for it to fit into the canon of the games. Like how Sonic says he's never encountered an Eggman robot that wasn't powered by Flicky, when those became commonplace from Sonic Heroes onward. Or later on, where he acts like he's never encountered a robot knockoff of himself. Apparently, Ian Flynn and the Sonic War team attempted to point out these inconsistencies to the show's staff, but for one reason or another, their concerns were ignored. Seriously, poor Ian. He tried his very best to have Prime make sense in canon, only for the internet to blame the continuity errors on him. Now granted, Prime not being in line with canon doesn't really affect its quality, but it bothers me, damn it. With all that said though, despite my issues with it, I thought that season 1 was pretty enjoyable. It might not be anything special, but it's still fun, well animated, sets up some potentially interesting storylines, and is an all-around solid start to Sonic Prime. While I have heard some claim that Season 2 is an improvement over the first, I honestly wasn't all that impressed with it. While it's not bad at all, I was really expecting Season 2 to be the point where Sonic Prime would iron out its kinks and go to more interesting places. Instead, it just kind of feels like more of what we saw in Season 1, only now the show's problems are much more apparent. I already complained about how Sonic's arc wasn't paced very well in Season 1, but there was at least an effort to show Sonic going through this journey of self-improvement. Here though, Sonic isn't really given anything noteworthy to do. It just doesn't feel like his character advances all that much. In fact, most of the characters don't really get much interesting to do here. Even Rusty Rose, a character with so much promise, completely fizzles out not long into the season, with her inevitable face turn feeling really abrupt and underwhelming. With only a few noteworthy exceptions, all of the characters this season feel like they're just kind of going through the motions and not much else. This is a direct result of the season's pacing. While Season 1 did have pacing issues, with some episodes feeling like they could have been cut in half, as well as the first couple of episodes constantly switching back and forth in time, there was still a sense that the narrative was moving forward, and the show was willing to slow down at points to give the characters time to breathe. Season 2, however, gives a lot less time for character moments, and is much more interested in moving from one action sequence to the next with little downtime in between. Now don't get me wrong, it's still great action, but after a while, you start to notice how threadbare the plots of these episodes are. Now most of this season is Sonic moving from one point to the next, gathering the prism shards, and not much else. How you can barely remember what happens in those episodes beyond the fighting. What makes the problem worse is that this season feels so dragged out in places. Season 2 is 8 episodes long, but it very easily could have hit the exact same story beats in 5 without anything being lost. This is also the point where the concept of shadow spaces starts to fall apart. For whatever reason, the other two shadow spaces spaces aren't populated alternate universes, but instead the Grim, a barren, lifeless world that we saw a bit of in Season 1, and what's essentially a ghost of Green Hill, which is kind of disappointing since it means we immediately return to Boss Cage Maze and No Place, worlds that weren't interesting to begin with, after it feels like we just left them. This also means that there isn't a world that puts focus on an alternate Rouge that contrasts with the main one. In fact, they end up not doing a whole lot with Rouge in this show. I mean, I'm cool with Big being a glorified background character here, since that's basically the joke with him in the games, but Rouge feels really wasted here. She is so underutilized that you could feasibly remove her and her variants from the story, and literally nothing would change. This also raises more questions about what the Chaos Council's whole deal is, because not only are all of the Eggmans native to one universe somehow, but Eggman has 5 variants, while the rest of the cast only has 3. Why? I guess we're just gonna have to wait until the final season to get the story on these guys, which I'm going to pretend I haven't watched already for the sake of this bit. With all that said, I wouldn't call Season 2 bad. There's still stuff to like here. First off, this season introduces Chaos Sonic, who is straight up my favorite character in the entire show. This is just such a fun take on Metal Sonic. Instead of being Sonic's opposite and the silent, ruthless killer robot, Chaos Sonic takes all Sonic's worst traits and cranks them up to 11. He's just this hilariously obnoxious tool, and I can't get enough of him.
Looking at you is like looking in a mirror. Only I'm all sad and pathetic. Step 1, beat you to a pulp, obviously. Step 2, a rebrand. T-shirts, pop albums, a chili dog flavored soft drink called Chaos Sonic's Chaos Tonic.
It's such a shame that he's just a one-off character. I would have loved to see him as a recurring enforcer for the Chaos Council. Hell, I would have been down to see Chaos Sonic pull Sonic Heroes and hijack the role of main villain. The stuff with Shao and 9 is also great. Shao and Sonic have such a fun dynamic here, with Shao constantly being fed up with Sonic's bullshit, and Sonic always taking the opportunity to snark at Shadow. As for 9, this season takes his character in a really unexpected, interesting direction, and introduces an intriguing conflict between him and Sonic. 9, who's come to genuinely care about Sonic, believes that once his world's restored, he'll throw him away in favor of his tales, convinced that Sonic sees him as nothing but a shadow of his best friend, rather than as his own person. This leads to the season ending with 9 taking the Paradox Prism for himself to create his own world, effectively making him the show's true main villain. I can't stress enough how amazing of an idea it is to have the ultimate villain that Sonic needs to overcome be an alternate version of Tails. The conflict the Season 2 finale sets up here is just so interesting. It's too bad that this level of writing wasn't present for most of this season. All in all, I think Season 2 is very uneven. While I really liked its first and final episodes, with them probably being the highlights of the entire show for me, a lot of what was in between was kind of a slog and not very interesting. Again, while it's not without its moments, I'd say Season 2 is an overall step down from the first season. That being said, with the way it ends, it's very possible that Season 3 could be the best season yet. You know, so as long as the previous season's pacing issues are ironed out, stuff like the Chaos Council gets a proper explanation, and the resolution isn't this total cop-out that ends up making this entire show pointless.
Foreshadowing is a literary device in which...
I'm going to be perfectly honest, I originally didn't even bother watching Season 3 when it first premiered. Between how meh I was about Season 2, and the largely negative reaction this season got, I just couldn't be bothered. And after finally watching it for this video, I have to say, I really wasn't missing out on much. As I ever so subtly alluded to earlier, I didn't exactly care for Season 3. My main issue here has to be that this season's pacing is infinitely worse than that of the previous ones, and keep in mind that the first 2 seasons already had serious pacing issues. While I thought its first episode was a pretty solid start, it doesn't take long for Season 3 to evolve into nothing but non-stop fighting between the heroes and 9's forces. Again, it's great action, but after a while, it gets seriously exhausting. It's just a constant pattern of 9 wrecking the heroes getting the upper hand, Sonic trying to reason with 9 to no avail, and then the cycle starts anew. Calm down, 9. We're your friends. Shut up, Sonic. I'll kill you. Even when compared to the last season, there's hardly anything really going on in the plot. This final season's 7 episodes long, but there's literally 3 episodes of story here max. I think that Sonic Prime's 3rd season suffers from the same issues that most of Marvel's Disney Plus shows do. Instead of having self-contained stories that contribute to an ongoing narrative, this season just feels like one long, dragged-out movie split into parts. This is especially noticeable given how the majority of the season takes place in a single location, the Grim. Not even 9 was able to salvage this season for me. Like, it was really cool seeing a version of Tails that goes full supervillain at first, but just like the constant action, the stuff with 9 gets really repetitive really fast. He's just constantly saying some sort of variation of, "I need Sonic's energy," and "I don't trust you, Sonic." It gets seriously boring, which is something I shouldn't be saying about anything that involves an evil Tails. Oh, and were you hoping for an explanation on what the Chaos Council are? Too bad! Their origins are never explained. There are just 5 Eggmans of different ages living in one universe, because reasons. Meanwhile, Rusty Rose, a character who was filled with so much intrigue and mystery, also never has her origins explored, and her arc comes to a really lackluster end, with Rusty realizing that, apparently, the Flicky inside of her wasn't actually powering her, and that it was just a symbol of her oppression or some crap, and she doesn't need it because she's her own person or something, and man was this character completely squandered. The show could have done something really cool, like having Rusty sacrifice herself to save the Flicky inside of her, like Gamma in Sonic Adventure, but instead, we have this nothing, anticlimactic, wet fart of a conclusion for a character that could have been so amazing. Speaking of poor character arcs, the show at this point kind of realizes that Sonic's arc has been an afterthought for a while now, so they just resort to directly telling the audience that Sonic's changed. There's a point where 9 sees Sonic taking the time to formulate a plan with Baton Rouge? I literally just got the joke! And 9 straight up says that Sonic's never done something like this before, because why show us Sonic gradually growing as a person when you can just tell us that the growth happened? Also, when Sonic gets home, everyone comments how different he is now, even though he really doesn't act all that differently from how he was at the start of the show. But Sonic Prime needs to pretend that they did anything with Sonic's arc here, so whatever. My god, what was the point in any of this? Then there's the ending, which has Sonic restoring his world and returning it to right before he shattered the Paradox Prism, with Shao teleporting it away. Wait, so they prevented the Paradox Prism from being shattered, the thing that created the Shatter Spaces to begin with. Did Sonic and Shao just erase those universes? This never gets addressed in the show, which led many people to assume the worst. However, I think that the sequel hook at the end seemed to imply that the Shatter Spaces are still around. But I thought the other universes were created from the Paradox Prism's shattering. Is the implication here that the Shatter Spaces always existed? Because the show seemed to imply that they're fragments of Sonic's world, which I assumed that meant Sonic's world and the Shatter Spaces can't coexist, and would lead to some sort of moral conundrum where Sonic would have to figure out a way to restore his world without destroying the Shatter Spaces. But I guess the Shatter Spaces just aren't fragments of Sonic's world anymore? Then what did Sonic breaking the Paradox Prism even do? And if Shatter Spaces always existed, then why don't any of them have a Sonic or Shadow? And again, what was up with the Chaos Council? What are Shatter Spaces even supposed to be anymore? What are the rules here? Honestly, I wanted to give a more extreme reaction, but I already spoiled the ending for myself months ago, and this season left me too worn out to actually care all that much. Honestly, I'm almost disappointed that the implications of the ending weren't as horrific or dire as people made it out to be. At the very least, a slap in the face Star vs. X ending would have made me feel something in this boring as sin season. I'm sorry, but man, this season was such a rough watch. Season 2 at least had some level of intrigue and introduced some great ideas, but Season 3? Hardly anything of note happens here. Most of the ideas and concepts introduced previously aren't elaborated on, none of the characters have much of anything interesting to do, and the pacing goes from wonky to just plain abysmal. So is there anything that I liked about Season 3? I still like Sonic and Shao's dynamic. One of the doctors called Shao an edgelord. That was pretty funny. Yeah, this season kind of sucks. I genuinely wanted to leave Sonic Prime, thinking that the backlash against it was overblown, but my god, that final third basically ruined the entire series for me. It sucks because there's so much I love about this show. The animation's excellent, the fight scenes are exciting, the voice acting is top notch, the premise is interesting, I really like some of the new characters, and it has a ton of really cool ideas. Despite all of this though, it's really hard for me to recommend Sonic Prime. Not just because of the terrible pacing, but because nothing really goes anywhere. Potentially interesting implications, like the Shadow Space variants representing different aspects of the cast, and Sonic's world being unable to coexist with the Shadow Spaces, are completely disregarded. None of the character arcs have any sort of satisfying conclusion. Nothing about how exactly these Shadow Spaces operate is ever elaborated on. Hell, we don't even get an explanation on the origins of the main villains. It all makes it feel like barely anything was accomplished in this show. Apparently, there's supposed to be an IDW miniseries based on the show, so maybe it'll end up clearing some things up, but I honestly feel so burned out by Sonic Prime at this point that I don't really care enough to find out. So now that we all understand the problems that plague Sonic Prime, I want to take the time to explain what I'd personally change about the show in order to improve it. For starters, instead of Sonic shattering the Paradox Prism, resulting in the creation of the Shadow Spaces, have its effects be that Sonic's erased from the timeline, which results in the dystopian world where Eggman wins, and have the show take place solely in that universe. With how New York City is the only somewhat interesting universe in Sonic Prime, as well as how, in the grand scheme of things, the other AUs don't contribute all that much to the story, I think it would just make more sense to ditch the multiverse angle altogether and spend that time building a single, coherent bad future AU. I'd much rather have one fully realized alternate universe than several half-baked ones. Then use that bad future timeline as an opportunity to examine just what these characters would be if Sonic was never in their lives. The series already did a good job of showing the positive impact Sonic had on Tails' life and how different he'd be without him, so why stop there? Actually delve into these characters' backstories and show how Sonic ended up changing their lives for the better. Because you can't tell me that Knuckles and Rouge would be hanging out in Green Hill in a world where Sonic doesn't exist. Hell, they wouldn't do that in a world where Sonic does exist. Now onto the topic of Sonic himself. If you want to tell a story about him learning to value his friends and the life he has, have him start out as this arrogant little prick who, while heroic, is also inconsiderate and dismissive of others. Once he's transported to New York City, have him gradually be changed by seeing more of how utterly messed up this world is, and how utterly broken and bitter Eggman's reign has left these versions of his friends, with the entire experience making him realize just how much they truly mean to him. Again, they touch upon this idea with Sonic and Nine's relationship, but I would much rather this extend to the entire cast. Have Sonic be more flawed. Have this adventure lead him to grow into the more mature, kind Sonic we see in the games. Speaking of which, if you want this characterization to work in the game's canon, as opposed to vaguely taking place sometime after Sonic Advance 3, I think it'd make the most sense to place the show in between the events of Adventure and Adventure 2. I'm not sure how realistic that would be, since that would be no Shadow, which they can't really do, since it's Shadow, but this is just a hypothetical show that would almost certainly never exist, so who cares if it's realistic or not. Also, instead of whatever the hell they were doing with the Chaos Council, have the main villain be this one alternate Eggman who's a far greater threat than the main one, whose vast resources and complete grip on the planet force Sonic to realize that he has to cooperate with the others if he wants to take him down. None of that Mickey Mouse Clubhouse bullcrap that they pulled with the Chaos Council. A totally original comparison that no one has made before. Finally, have most episodes be self-contained stories that also further both the conflict against Eggman as well as Sonic's development. So basically, what I'm asking for is Sonic SatAM, but with the animation quality and voice acting of Sonic Prime. Now with all of that said, while I can't find my heart to call Sonic Prime straight up bad, it still ended up being really disappointing. Despite it having so much going for it, Sonic Prime is ultimately undermined by poor pacing and a lack of focus on the ideas it introduces. It had a lot of potential, but as it stands, Sonic Prime is pretty mid, and I don't see myself revisiting this show beyond looking up the Sonic v Shadow fights on YouTube. Anyways, what were your thoughts on Sonic Prime? Do you think that it deserves the hate it gets? Are you too grappling with how the latest Tales 2 cemented Sonic Prime as a part of the canon, and that we're completely powerless to stop it? Feel free to discuss in the comments below if you like. Maybe even consider subscribing if you want to hear more of me rambling on about cartoons. Anyways, here's hoping that the next Sonic series doesn't disappoint fans like Sonic Prime. Right. That was a thing. Being a Sonic fan is suffering.